What would you do if the world forgot your greatest sacrifice? Picture the sting of betrayal as a judge's gavel looms over you. No one to defend your honor. Your legacy reduced to a mugshot on the evening news. This was the crushing reality for Samuel Hayes, a 78-year-old veteran. As he sat alone in a cold courtroom, his wrists bound, his faded jacket stained with the grime of a city alley. The prosecutor sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "No lawyer? Let's get this over with." But then, the heavy oak doors creaked open, a sound that sliced through the tension, and a figure in a crisp military uniform stepped forward, his medals glinting under the harsh fluorescent lights, a beacon of hope in a sea of indifference. Samuel's heart raced. Could this be his salvation? Imagine yourself in Samuel's shoes, a forgotten hero, abandoned by the system he swore to protect, your life hanging in the balance. What happens next? Will this officer reveal a shocking truth that turns the trial upside down? Or will Samuel face an even greater betrayal before justice prevails? Share your thoughts in the comments below and help us reach 1,000 subscribers on Daily Narrated Stories by hitting that subscribe button. We're so close to sharing more stories like this with the world, stories that remind us of the heroes we've overlooked. Samuel Hayes wasn't always a name on a court docket, a mere entry in a system that churned through lives with cold efficiency. Decades ago, his voice had been a lighthouse in the storm of war, commanding a paratrooper unit through the suffocating jungles of a conflict that left scars deeper than the ones on his body. At 78, his face was a weathered canvas, lines carved by grief, eyes clouded with the ghosts of battles fought, hands that trembled when the air grew too still, as if the silence itself carried the echoes of gunfire. The local headlines didn't care about the Silver Star he'd earned in 1971, a medal pinned to his chest by a general who'd looked him in the eye and called him a hero, his voice thick with gratitude. They didn't mention the countless nights he'd spent mentoring young soldiers after the war, his words a steady anchor as he taught them how to survive not just the battlefield, but the invisible battles that followed. Those fought in the quiet of their own minds, in the moments when the world felt too heavy to bear. Nor did they speak of the shrapnel still lodged in his knee, a jagged piece of metal that ached with every step, a constant reminder of a life spent serving others, a life that had once meant something. Instead, they painted him as a vagrant, a troublemaker who'd resisted arrest outside a women's shelter in the heart of the city, his name dragged through the mud with headlines that screamed of violence and defiance, their words a betrayal sharper than any enemy's blade. The truth was far more heartbreaking, a story buried beneath layers of assumptions and haste, a story that deserved to be heard. Samuel had been trying to shield a woman named Clara, a 42-year-old mother whose eyes held the same terror he'd seen in soldiers under fire, the kind of fear that stripped away reason and left only survival. Clara had missed the shelter's curfew by a mere 15 minutes, her hands trembling as she fumbled with her bag, her breath hitching with the weight of a panic she couldn't control. She'd spent years escaping an abusive marriage, each day a battle against the memories that haunted her, memories of raised fists, of screams that echoed in her dreams, of nights spent hiding in the shadows, praying for safety. The shelter had been her sanctuary, a place where she could finally breathe. But that night, her fragile peace was shattered. The security guard, a young man named Ethan Carter, was new to the job, his patience worn thin by a long shift, his temper quick to flare under pressure. He'd begun yelling, his voice a hammer against Clara's fragile state, demanding she leave the premises immediately. "You're out of time," he shouted, his words sharp and unyielding, oblivious to the way Clara's body shrank inward, her hands clutching her ears as if to block out a past that refused to stay buried. Her PTSD had kicked in, a tidal wave of fear that left her frozen, her breath shallow, her eyes wide with a terror that Samuel recognized all too well. He'd seen that look before, on the faces of men in foxholes, their hands gripping rifles as mortars exploded overhead, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. In villages where children hid behind their mothers, their eyes pleading for safety, their small hands trembling with fear. It was the look of someone who'd seen hell and lived to carry its weight. A look that Samuel had never been able to forget. He didn't hesitate. He stepped between Clara and Ethan, his movements slow but deliberate, his presence a shield against the storm. He raised a hand, not in anger, but in peace, his voice low and steady, the kind of tone he'd learned to use when calming a panicked recruit in the midst of chaos, a tone that had saved lives in the darkest of moments. "She's not a threat," he said softly, his words a lifeline in the chaos, each syllable measured to cut through the panic, to offer a moment of calm in the storm. "She just needs a moment. Let her breathe." But Ethan, fueled by frustration and a need to assert control, wouldn't listen. His face reddened, his voice rising as he pointed a finger at Samuel, his tone a mix of bravado and impatience. "Move, old man, or I'll make you," he snapped, his eyes flashing with anger, his hands clenched in a fist at his sides. Samuel didn't flinch. He stood his ground, his eyes locked on Clara's, willing her to focus on him, to find an anchor in the storm. "Look at me," he whispered to her, his voice barely audible over Ethan's shouting, his words a quiet promise. "You're safe. I've got you." But the situation spiraled beyond Samuel's control, a runaway train he couldn't stop. Ethan, feeling challenged, called the police, his voice crackling through the radio with accusations that twisted the truth into something ugly. "I've got an assault here," he claimed, his words a distortion of the reality unfolding, a lie that would set the course for everything that followed. When the officers arrived, their sirens piercing the night air like a scream, they saw what they expected. An old man in tattered clothes, his jacket stained with the dirt of the streets, his face weathered and worn, his body stooped with age. They didn't ask for Samuel's side, didn't pause to consider the context, didn't see the man who'd once led soldiers through hell and brought them back alive. To them, he was just another homeless troublemaker, a stereotype they'd seen too many times, a problem to be dealt with quickly and forgotten. An officer, a young man named Daniel Reed, stepped forward, his hand already on his taser, his eyes hard with the kind of certainty that left no room for questions. "Step aside now," he barked, his voice sharp with authority, his posture rigid with the weight of his badge. Samuel turned to face him, his hands still raised in a gesture of peace, but his knees ached and his body was slower than it once was, the years weighing heavily on his frame. Before he could speak, before he could explain, the taser crackled, a sharp burst of electricity that sent Samuel crashing to the pavement, the cold concrete biting into his cheek as pain seared through his body like a wildfire. His vision blurred, the world tilting as he gasped for air, the weight of betrayal pressing down on him. A betrayal that cut deeper than any wound he'd ever endured. They dragged him into a squad car, his legs too weak to resist, the cuffs biting into his wrists with a cold, unyielding grip, Clara's terrified face fading from view as the door slammed shut, leaving him alone with his thoughts. In the back of the squad car, the air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and leather, the hum of the engine a low drone that vibrated through Samuel's aching body. His mind drifted, unbidden, to a time long past, a memory that surfaced like a ghost from the shadows. He saw himself in 1971, leading his unit through a jungle so dense the air itself felt alive with danger. The canopy above them a tangle of green that blocked out the sun, casting the world in a perpetual twilight. They'd been ambushed, their radio destroyed by an enemy sniper, the crack of the shot echoing through the trees like a death knell. Their extraction point had been compromised, overrun by enemy forces, leaving them stranded with no way out. Samuel had carried a wounded soldier on his back for miles, his own leg bleeding from a shrapnel wound, the jagged metal tearing into his flesh with every step, his body screaming in protest as he pushed forward through the mud and the heat. The soldier, a boy named Thomas, had been barely 19, his face pale with fear, his breath shallow as blood seeped from a wound in his side. "Stay with me," Samuel had whispered, his voice a lifeline in the darkness, his strength the only thing keeping them both alive. "We're getting out of this." Thomas had lived, but the weight of that day, and so many others, had never left Samuel, a burden he carried in the quiet moments, a burden that whispered to him now as he sat in the back of the squad car, the city lights blurring past the window like a dream he couldn't wake from. He wondered if Thomas would even remember him, if anyone would, or if his life had been reduced to this, a forgotten man in a forgotten moment, his sacrifices erased by time. 3 days later, Samuel sat in a courtroom that felt as foreign as the battlefields he'd once navigated, a sterile world of polished wood and harsh fluorescent lights that cast long, unforgiving shadows across the room. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of old paper and the faint tang of cleaning solution, a clinical atmosphere that seemed to mock the warmth of the life he'd once known. His wrists ached from the cuffs, the metal digging into his skin with a relentless pressure, his faded jacket a stark contrast to the polished suits around him, a symbol of the divide between who he was and how the world saw him. His family was long gone. His only son, Michael, lost to a car accident a decade earlier, a wound that still bled in quiet moments, a grief that whispered to him in the silence, a pain that never dulled. Michael had been his light, a boy who'd grown into a man with his father's quiet strength, his laughter a melody that had once filled Samuel's days with joy. They'd spent evenings fishing by the lake near their home, Michael's small hands gripping the pole as Samuel taught him how to cast, their voices mingling with the rustle of the wind through the trees. "One day, Dad," Michael had said, his eyes bright with dreams, "I'll be a soldier like you." But that day never came, stolen by a drunk driver on a rain-slicked road, leaving Samuel with nothing but memories and a hole in his heart that would never heal. Now, he had no one left to call, no one to stand by his side, no one to remind him that he was more than the sum of his scars. His public defender, a young woman named Sarah Ellis, had abandoned him hours before, her voice a distant echo as she muttered about a plea deal before rushing to another case, her heels clicking against the tile as she disappeared down the hall. Sarah was overworked, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion, her caseload a mountain she could never hope to climb. "Take the deal," she'd said, her voice clipped, her eyes not meeting his as she shuffled through her files, her hands trembling with the weight of too many lives in her hands. "It's your best shot." Samuel had watched her leave, the door swinging shut behind her with a soft thud, and felt the weight of abandonment settle into his bones, a familiar ache that echoed the loneliness of the war. He'd sat by a river that night in 1971, the water black under the moonless sky, his hands stained with blood, his own, his men's, the enemy's, his heart heavy with the weight of decisions no man should have to make. He'd whispered their names into the darkness, a quiet litany of the fallen, a promise to carry them with him always. Now, in the courtroom, he whispered Michael's name under his breath, a quiet prayer for strength, a reminder of why he'd kept going all these years. The prosecutor, a man in a sharp suit named Victor Lang, stood with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, his files stacked neatly on the table before him, his smirk a silent taunt across the courtroom. Victor was young, ambitious, his eyes sharp with the hunger of a man who saw cases like Samuel's as stepping stones, a way to prove his efficiency to the higher-ups, to climb the ladder of a system that rewarded speed over truth. "He's been offered 90 days, Victor announced, his tone dripping with indifference, his eyes flicking to Samuel as if he were an inconvenience to be dealt with swiftly, a problem to be solved and forgotten. "Perhaps he forgot," he added, his voice laced with a mockery that made Samuel's hands clench in his lap, a flicker of anger stirring beneath the exhaustion. The judge, a woman in her late 50s named Margaret Klein, sighed, her patience wearing thin, her glasses slipping down her nose as she shuffled through the docket, her movements mechanical, her mind already on the next case. Judge Klein had seen too many cases like this. Men and women chewed up by a system that valued speed over truth, their stories reduced to a few lines on a page, their lives dismissed with the bang of a gavel. "Mr. Hayes, do you understand the charges?" she asked, her voice sharp with the weight of routine, her eyes barely lifting from the papers before her. "Do you have counsel?" Samuel's gaze drifted to the American flag above the bench, its stars a reminder of a promise he'd once believed in, a promise of justice, of honor, of a country that cared for its own. But that promise felt hollow now, a distant memory in a world that had moved on without him. He didn't answer. He couldn't find the words, not when the flag seemed to mock him with its silent presence. Its colors faded in his mind like the ideals he'd once fought for. "Mr. Hayes," the judge pressed, her voice sharper now, a note of irritation creeping in, her patience fraying at the edges. And then the doors swung open, a sound that cut through the monotony like a gunshot, a sound that changed everything. The courtroom turned as one, a collective gasp rippling through the gallery, the air suddenly thick with anticipation, the tension palpable as I turned to the door. A tall man in a pristine military uniform strode in, his boots echoing against the tiled floor with a rhythmic precision that spoke of discipline and purpose, each step a declaration of intent. Colonel Marcus Steele, a decorated officer still in active duty, carried himself with a quiet intensity that demanded respect without a word, his presence a force that shifted the energy in the room. His silver oak leaves gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights. But it was the fire in his eyes that held the room captive, a burning determination that seemed to sear through the apathy around him, a fire that refused to be ignored. His chest was adorned with combat ribbons, each one a story of sacrifice, of battles fought and won, of lives saved and lost. He didn't glance at the judge, didn't acknowledge the crowd whispering in the gallery, their voices a low hum of curiosity and awe. He walked straight to the defense table, his movements deliberate, his posture rigid with the weight of his mission, and sat beside Samuel, the chair creaking softly under his weight. Leaning in, he whispered, his voice a low rumble that carried to the front row, a promise wrapped in steel, a vow that echoed with the weight of years. "You gave me everything I am, Sergeant Major. I'll never forget." The gallery erupted in murmurs, a wildfire of curiosity spreading through the room, whispers of who is he and what's happening filling the air like a storm. The judge's pen froze mid-note, her brow arching in surprise, her eyes narrowing as she took in the scene, a flicker of curiosity breaking through her earlier indifference. Victor's smirk vanished, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty, his fingers tightening around his pen as he sensed the shift in the room, the ground beneath him slipping away. "Colonel," Judge Klein began, her voice steadying as she adjusted her glasses, her tone a mix of curiosity and caution. "May I ask what you're doing in my courtroom?" Marcus stood, his posture rigid, his gaze unwavering, a soldier facing a new kind of battlefield, one where words were weapons and truth was the prize. "I'm here for the man who saved my life," he said, his words cutting through the tension like a blade, each syllable deliberate and heavy with meaning, a declaration that left no room for doubt. "He's not alone. Not today, not ever." Victor shot to his feet, his voice sharp, a mix of indignation and panic, his face flushed as he scrambled to regain control. "Your Honor, this is irregular. The colonel isn't a licensed attorney. He can't represent the defendant." His words were a desperate grasp at the rules, a shield against the storm he could feel brewing. Marcus didn't flinch. "I'm not his attorney," he clarified, his tone calm but firm, a quiet authority that brooked no argument, his eyes locking onto Victor's with the intensity that made the younger man falter. "I'm here as a character witness and support. I'll secure proper counsel, but I request the court's indulgence for a brief statement." Victor objected again, his voice rising with frustration, his hands gesturing wildly as he tried to regain the upper hand, his composure unraveling with every word. "This is a courtroom, not a theater," he snapped, his face red with anger, his voice echoing through the room. But Judge Klein raised a hand, silencing him with a look that could have frozen fire, her eyes sharp and unyielding, a decision forming in her mind. "Objection overruled," she said, her decision surprising even herself, a flicker of curiosity in her eyes, a spark of something that hadn't been there before. "Colonel Steele may proceed. This court seeks truth, not just procedure." Marcus stood taller, if that were possible, and began to speak, his voice steady, each word a hammer, striking the anvil of the courtroom's conscience, each sentence a brushstroke on the portrait of a man the world had forgotten. He spoke of a mission in 1985, a classified operation deep in hostile territory, a memory that still haunted his dreams, a memory that had shaped him into the man he was today. Samuel, then a sergeant major, had led a squad of 7 men through a nightmare of ambushes and broken communications, their radio destroyed by an enemy sniper, the crack of the shot echoing through the jungle like a death knell. Their extraction point had been overrun, leaving them stranded, wounded, and hunted, the jungle alive with the sounds of danger, branches snapping, distant shouts, the hum of insects that seemed to mock their desperation. Samuel, despite shrapnel tearing through his thigh and a bullet graze on his arm, had carried a young private, Marcus, on his back for 14 miles through dense jungle, under the constant threat of enemy fire. The air had been thick with humidity, the heat pressing down on them like a physical weight. Samuel's breath ragged as he pushed forward, his boots sinking into the mud with every step, his body screaming in protest as he carried Marcus to safety. "Stay with me," he'd whispered to Marcus, his voice a lifeline in the darkness, his strength the only thing keeping them both alive, his determination a fire that refused to be extinguished. "We're getting out of this." Marcus's voice caught as he recounted the memory, a crack in his stoic facade that sent a ripple of emotion through the room, the weight of that day palpable in his words, a weight that had never left him. "That private was me," he said, his voice breaking for the first time, his hands clenching at his sides as he fought to keep his composure, his eyes glistening with unshed tears as he looked at Samuel, the man who'd given him a future. Marcus produced a leather portfolio, its edges worn from years of careful handling, a testament to the importance of what it held. He pulled out documents that gleamed with official seals, their pages yellowed, but the words still clear, a record of a life lived in service. A letter from the Department of Defense confirmed Samuel's service record. His Silver Star, his commendations for valor, his decades of mentorship in the reserves, shaping young soldiers with lessons of courage and compassion that went beyond the battlefield, lessons that had saved lives long after the war had ended. "This court sees a criminal," Marcus said, his voice rising, a controlled storm brewing in his words, each syllable a challenge to the room's apathy, a call to see the man Samuel truly was. "I see a man who taught us not just how to fight, but how to live. A man who showed us dignity in the face of chaos, who carried me when he could have saved himself." The courtroom was silent, the weight of his words pressing down on every soul present, a heavy blanket of truth that smothered the earlier indifference, a truth that demanded to be acknowledged. The jury shifted uncomfortably, their faces a mix of shame and awe, some wiping at their eyes as the reality of Samuel's sacrifice settled in, their earlier assumptions crumbling under the weight of the truth. Judge Klein leaned forward, her gaze softening as she studied Samuel, her earlier impatience replaced by a quiet respect, a recognition of the man who sat before her. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice gentler now, a note of regret in her tone, a question that needed to be asked. "Why didn't you tell anyone who you were when you were arrested?" Samuel spoke for the first time, his voice a low rasp, rough from disuse but steady as steel, a voice that had once commanded men through the chaos of war, a voice that now carried the weight of a lifetime of being unseen. "I didn't think it mattered anymore," he said, the words hanging in the air, heavy with the weight of years spent invisible, unvalued, a man who'd given everything only to be forgotten by the country he'd served. The confession was a quiet dagger, cutting through the room's tension, exposing the raw wound of his isolation, a wound that had festered for decades. Marcus shook his head, his jaw tight, his eyes blazing with a fierce determination, a fire that refused to be extinguished. "It always matters," he said, his voice a vow, a promise to the man who'd shaped him, a promise to make the world see. He turned to face Victor directly, his gaze pinning the prosecutor in place, his voice a quiet thunder that echoed through the room. "The police report is incomplete," he said, each word a challenge, a demand for justice. The body cam footage wasn't reviewed. The woman he protected wasn't interviewed. This isn't justice, it's convenience. Victor shuffled his papers, his confidence crumbling under the scrutiny, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to regain his footing, his earlier arrogance replaced by a flicker of doubt. "We follow the evidence provided," he stammered, his tone defensive, his eyes darting to the judge as if seeking rescue. "If there are mitigating circumstances, there are," Marcus cut in, his voice unyielding, a storm that wouldn't be silenced, his eyes burning with the fire of a man who'd seen too much to let this stand. "And if you'd looked beyond a homeless-looking veteran, you'd have found them." The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted, a palpable change as indifference gave way to uncomfortable awareness, a collective awakening that rippled through the room like a wave. A journalist in the back row typed furiously on her laptop, her fingers a blur as she captured every word, her eyes wide with the realization that this story was bigger than she'd imagined, a story that could change lives. A police officer near the door removed his cap, his face pale as recognition dawned, his hands clenching the cap as if it were an anchor in the storm of his own guilt, a guilt that whispered of the role he'd played in this injustice. Marcus turned to the judge, his posture still rigid, his voice steady but laced with urgency, a man who knew the clock was ticking. "Your Honor, I request a 48-hour continuance to secure proper counsel and gather the evidence that should have been collected from the start," he said, his words a plea wrapped in determination, a demand for the justice Samuel deserved. Victor opened his mouth to object, his face flushed with frustration, his hands trembling as he clutched his files. But Judge Klein silenced him with a look, her eyes sharp and unyielding, a decision made. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice softer now, a note of compassion breaking through her earlier formality, a question that needed an answer. "Is it true? Were you defending someone?" Samuel nodded once, his eyes still on the flag. Its stars a bittersweet reminder of a promise he'd clung to for decades, a promise he'd never stopped believing in. "She was having a flashback," he said, his voice steady but quiet, each word a testament to his resolve, a truth that couldn't be ignored. The guard was yelling. "I just stepped in." Judge Klein's expression softened further, a flicker of regret in her eyes, a silent acknowledgement of the system's failure, a failure she'd been a part of. "And you never told the officers?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, her hands still as she waited for his answer. "They didn't ask, Your Honor," Samuel replied, his tone quiet but firm, a truth that cut deeper than any accusation, a truth that laid bare the flaws in the system that had failed him. "They saw what they wanted to see." Marcus placed a hand on Samuel's shoulder, a gesture of unwavering support, a silent promise that he wouldn't let this man be forgotten again, a bond that had survived the test of time. "That's been his story since he came home," he said, his voice thick with emotion, his eyes glistening with unshed tears, a man who'd seen the cost of war and the cost of peace. "People see an old man. They don't see the hero beneath." Victor cleared his throat, his tone weaker now, his earlier confidence a distant memory, his voice trembling as he tried to salvage his case. "Your Honor, regardless of his past service, the law." Judge Klein interrupted, her voice sharp, a fire igniting in her eyes, a fire that had been dormant too long, "is meant to serve justice, not technicalities. Colonel, you have 48 hours. I expect evidence, not just sentiment, when we reconvene." The gavel fell, a sharp crack that echoed through the room, a sound that marked the beginning of a new chapter in Samuel's story, a chapter where he would finally be seen. Samuel turned to Marcus, his voice barely above a whisper, his eyes searching the younger man's face, a mix of gratitude and disbelief in his gaze. "You didn't have to do this, Marcus," he said, his tone heavy with the weight of all he'd lost, all he'd endured. The colonel's reply carried through the now silent courtroom, a testament to their bond, a promise forged in the fires of war, a promise that would never be broken. "You're right," he said, his voice steady, his eyes locked on Samuel's, a fire burning in their depths. "I didn't have to. I chose to. Just like you chose to carry me when you could have saved yourself." The judge delayed proceedings to verify Marcus's claims. Her chambers a flurry of activity as she awaited confirmation, her mind racing with the implications of what she'd heard. Within hours, confirmations flooded in, from military archives, Veterans Affairs, and even a retired general who called the judge's chambers directly, his voice gruff with emotion as he vouched for Samuel's character. His words a testament to the man Samuel had always been. Samuel Hayes had earned 3 commendations for valor, including a Silver Star with a Valor device, each one a testament to his courage, his selflessness, his unwavering commitment to those he served. He'd trained over 2,500 recruits in ethics, survival, and leadership, his lessons shaping generations of soldiers, his voice a steady guide in a world of chaos, a voice that had never wavered. He'd never sought recognition, never asked for special treatment, his humility a quiet strength that had defined his life, a strength that had carried him through the darkest moments. And perhaps most damning to the prosecution's case, he had a spotless record of de-escalating conflicts at veterans outreach programs, where he volunteered when his needs allowed, his presence a calming force in the storm of others' trauma, a force that had saved lives in ways the world would never know. Marcus didn't waste a second of the 48 hours, his determination a fire that burned brighter with every passing moment, a fire that refused to be extinguished. He assembled a team of 4 attorneys specializing in veterans' rights, each one handpicked for their passion and expertise, their offices a whirlwind of activity as they prepare to fight for Samuel, their voices a chorus of determination. He secured the full security footage from the shelter, a grainy video that told a story the police report had ignored, a story of a man who'd stood up for what was right, even when the world stood against him. He tracked down Clara, the woman at the heart of the incident, finding her in a small apartment on the edge of the city, her hands still trembling as she recounted that night, her voice a whisper of gratitude and pain. When the court reconvened, the gallery was overflowing, the air thick with anticipation, the tension palpable as the room filled with those who'd come to bear witness. Veterans in uniform stood at parade, rest along the back wall, their presence a silent tribute, their faces a mix of pride and sorrow, their eyes fixed on Samuel with a respect that needed no words. Reporters lined the left side, their cameras ready to capture every moment, their notebooks filled with questions that demanded answers, their pens poised to write a story that would echo through the city. Ordinary citizens filled every seat, drawn by the story that had spread like wildfire, a tale of injustice and redemption that had captured the city's heart, a tale that reminded them of the heroes they'd forgotten. The police report was dissected with meticulous care, every word scrutinized, every assumption challenged, the truth laid bare for all to see. Body cam footage, previously buried in the filing system, showed Samuel stepping between Clara and the guard, his arms outstretched but not threatening, his voice a soothing balm against the chaos, a voice that spoke of peace in a moment of violence. "She's having a flashback," he'd said, his tone calm, his posture defensive, not aggressive, a man who'd spent his life protecting others, even when it cost him everything. He intervened non-violently, Marcus emphasized, standing beside Samuel, who now wore a borrowed suit that hung loosely on his frame, the fabric a stark contrast to the worn jacket he'd worn that night, a symbol of the man he'd been and the man he was becoming. He was honoring the oath he took in 1968 to protect those who can't protect themselves. Marcus continued, his voice steady, his eyes locked on the judge, a fire burning in their depths that refused to be extinguished. The security guard, Ethan Carter, was called to testify, his hands fidgeting as he took the stand, his eyes darting to the floor as he spoke, his voice trembling with the weight of his actions. Under oath, he admitted to shouting at Clara, admitted that Samuel had never struck him, only stood in his way, a quiet barrier between her and harm. He kept saying, "She's having a flashback. Give her space," Ethan said, his voice reluctant, his shoulders hunched as if the weight of his actions pressed down on him, a weight he could no longer ignore. "I might have overreacted when he wouldn't move," he added, his words a quiet confession that echoed through the room, a confession that changed everything. Clara stood from the gallery when called, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the witness stand, her voice barely audible, a fragile thread in the heavy silence, a thread that held the weight of the truth. "I'm the one he protected," she said, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, her voice breaking as she spoke, her words a testament to the man who'd saved her. "I was having a panic attack. The lights, the yelling, it brought everything back. He knew what was happening when no one else did. He didn't hurt anyone. He helped me breathe again." Her words were a turning point, the final piece that shattered the prosecution's case, a truth that couldn't be ignored, a truth that demanded justice. The courtroom sat in weighted silence as Judge Klein reviewed the evidence before her, her hands steady as she turned each page, her eyes sharp with focus, her mind racing with the implications of what she'd heard. She removed her glasses, her gaze locking onto Samuel, a man she now saw with new eyes, a man who'd given everything and asked for nothing in return. "Charges are dropped with prejudice," she said, her voice steady but laced with emotion, a weight lifted from the room with her words, a weight that had pressed down on Samuel for far too long. She paused, then continued, her tone softer, more human, a humanity that had been missing from the proceedings until now. "Sergeant Major Samuel Hayes, this court apologizes for failing to see who you were, for failing to ask the right questions." Samuel blinked, the only sign of the storm within him, a man who'd spent decades invisible, now standing in the light, a man who'd finally been seen. "I'm just glad someone still sees me," he said, his voice a whisper, a quiet testament to the power of being seen, a power that had been denied him for too long. Marcus saluted him, a crisp, perfect motion that spoke of a bond unbroken by time, a gesture that brought tears to the eyes of the veterans in the gallery, a gesture that spoke of honor and respect. "They do now, sir," he replied, his voice steady, his eyes shining with pride, a pride that Samuel had earned 1,000 times over. Victor approached Samuel after the gavel fell, his expression humbled, his earlier arrogance replaced by a quiet respect, a respect he'd failed to show until now. "I was wrong," he said simply, extending a hand, his voice low but sincere, a man who'd been forced to confront his own failures. "I should have looked deeper." Samuel shook it without hesitation, his grip firm despite the tremble in his hands, his eyes meeting Victor's with a quiet dignity that spoke volumes. "We all miss things," he said, his tone free of bitterness, a man who'd spent his life forgiving the world's oversights, a man who'd never stopped believing in the good beneath the surface. Outside the courtroom, cameras flashed, a barrage of light that made Samuel flinch, the sudden attention a stark contrast to the decades he'd spent in the shadows. Marcus stayed close, a steadying presence, his hand resting lightly on Samuel's shoulder, a silent reminder that he wasn't alone. "You don't have to speak to them," he said, his voice low, his tone protective, a shield against the world that had already taken so much. But Samuel straightened his tie, a determined glint in his eye, a fire that had been rekindled after years of being dormant. He stepped forward, facing the microphones, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands, his words a quiet challenge to the world that had forgotten him. "I'm not a hero," he said, his tone firm, his eyes scanning the crowd with a quiet intensity. "I did what any of us would do. The real story isn't about me. It's about how easily we forget to look beyond what's in front of us." Marcus watched with pride as the man who'd taught him resilience now taught an entire city humility, his words a ripple that would spread far beyond the courthouse steps. That evening, at a small gathering Marcus had organized, the shelter's director, a woman named Elena Torres, approached Samuel, her eyes warm with admiration, her voice soft but sincere. "We'd like you to train our staff," she said, her hands clasped in front of her, a gesture of respect. "We need to learn how to recognize trauma, how to de-escalate. Would you consider it?" For the first time that day, Samuel's face broke into a full smile, the lines of his face softening with purpose, a purpose he'd thought he'd lost. "I'd be honored," he said, his voice alive with a passion that had been dormant too long, a passion that had once guided soldiers through the darkest of nights. Marcus watched from across the room as Samuel began speaking with Elena, his hands gesturing animatedly, sketching ideas in the air as if he were back on a training field, his voice steady and sure. "He's still teaching," observed a young captain who'd accompanied Marcus, her voice tinged with awe, her eyes fixed on Samuel with a respect that mirrored Marcus's own. "He never stopped," Marcus replied, a faint smile on his lips, his heart swelling with pride. The world just stopped listening. That night, a local news station ran the headline, "Veteran on trial for helping saved by former student." The word's a testament to the power of one man's loyalty, one man's refusal to let a hero be forgotten. The next morning, a small crowd gathered outside the courthouse, clapping as Samuel emerged, Marcus still at his side, a steadfast presence in a world that had once turned its back. A young girl approached, clutching a small flag, her eyes wide with wonder, her voice small but clear. "My mom's a soldier," she said, her hands trembling slightly as she held out the flag. "She says you're a legend." Samuel knelt despite the ache in his joints, his smile gentle, his eyes soft with a warmth that had been absent for too long. "Tell her I just did what we're trained to do. Look out for each other," he said, his voice steady, his words a lesson that would stay with the girl for years to come. That never expires. Days later, Samuel received a city commendation for civic honor, a moment of recognition that brought tears to the eyes of those who'd gathered to honor him. He accepted it not for himself, but for all the veterans still waiting to be seen, his words a quiet plea for a world that looked deeper. The shelter where he'd been arrested implemented immediate policy changes, renaming itself Hayes Haven, a safe space for trauma survivors with mandatory training for all staff, a testament to the change one man could inspire. Judge Klein sent Samuel a personal letter, her words a quiet testament to the impact of his story, her handwriting steady, but her tone heavy with reflection. "Thank you for reminding this courtroom that actions, not titles, define a man," she wrote, her words a promise to do better, to see more clearly. Justice requires clarity, not just procedure. The police department introduced mandatory training on recognizing PTSD in civilians and veterans, with the officer who'd arrested Samuel attending the first session Samuel helped lead, his eyes downcast, but his presence a silent apology. Marcus returned to his base, but made a point to visit Samuel every month, often bringing young cadets to learn from the man who'd stood firm without raising his voice, his lessons a bridge between generations. Samuel never sought fame, still wearing the same worn boots, still carrying the same quiet dignity. But now, when he passed the courthouse, officers nodded in respect. Not out of duty, but out of recognition, a recognition he'd earned through a lifetime of service. The real victory wasn't in the dropped charges or the apology. It was in the quiet ripples of change. Shelter staff who now asked better questions, police officers who looked closer, prosecutors who dug deeper, a city that had learned to see. 6 months later, Samuel moved into a small office at the Veterans Center, where he counseled those grappling with the same invisible scars he carried. His calendar filled quickly, his purpose renewed. "You saved more than my life that day in the jungle," Marcus told him during a quiet moment, his voice thick with gratitude, his eyes shining with a respect that had never wavered. "You showed me what strength really is." Samuel shook his head, a faint smile on his lips, his eyes soft with the wisdom of a life hard-earned. "We save each other," he said, his voice steady, his words a truth that had guided him through decades of darkness. That's the only battle worth fighting. When asked about his sudden recognition after decades of being unseen, Samuel would shrug, his movements slow but deliberate. "Being seen isn't what matters," he'd say, his tone quiet but firm, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Seeing others is." In a world often blinded by haste and assumptions, that lesson stood taller than any medal ever could, a lesson that would echo through the lives he'd touched, through the city that had finally learned to see him. Samuel Hayes' story is a testament to the enduring power of courage, loyalty, and the quiet strength that lives in those society too often overlooks. His journey reminds us that heroism doesn't fade with age. It transforms, finding new ways to heal and inspire. Through Marcus's unwavering support, Samuel reclaimed his dignity. But more than that, he sparked a movement of change that rippled through a city, a shelter, and countless lives. This is the essence of hope. The belief that one act of compassion can rewrite a story, that one voice can remind us to see beyond the surface. Take a moment to reflect. Have you ever overlooked someone whose story deserved to be heard? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's honor those who've been unseen by giving them a voice, by ensuring their stories live on. At Daily Narrated Stories, we're committed to bringing you tales that uplift, challenge, and inspire, stories that remind us of the heroes among us, the ones we've forgotten to see. But we need your help to keep these stories alive. We're so close to 1,000 subscribers, a milestone that will let us reach even more hearts, that will let us shine a light on more stories like Samuel's. Don't miss this chance to be part of something bigger. Subscribe to Daily Narrated Stories right now, before this moment slips away. Comment, share, and join us in ensuring no story and no hero is ever forgotten again. Together, we can make sure the world never stops listening.